I say welcome again to you and to Petra especially. We're going to talk about this book, Allt detta tillhör mig, in Swedish. It's been recently published in Swedish and it takes place in Mongolia and is a portrait of 4 generations of women who live in the country and live in the capital city, Ulaanbaatar. And it's actually been 10 years since you wrote this book, and you published several books since this one. And now you're here to talk about it. But 10 years is a long time. So how do you feel about it today?
Yeah, it's a long time, and this was my debut. It was my first book that I wrote when I was 22 or 23 years old, and I think the first book is always somehow special. I mean, I was not really aware of what I was doing when I was writing it, and didn't even think about publishing it. So it was purely matter of just pure inspiration and urge to write, and it was, on one hand it was difficult, and on the other it was the easiest, the book that was easiest to write, because there were no expectation, no real awareness of writing, no real pressure, nothing. So yeah.
Has it become harder?
Yeah, I think the most difficult was the second book to write, because after this book was published, suddenly I became a writer, or that's what critics said, about me, or what was mentioned in the reviews, whatever, and I didn't consider myself being a writer. Sometimes I don't even consider it now, but I felt like maybe it was all just pure accident, and I wouldn't be able to write anything else anymore. So the second book was difficult because of all these burdens, and then afterwards I kind of stopped taking care, stop bothering myself by all these thoughts, whether I'm a writer or not. Well, sometimes I still bother, but somehow I don't take it as seriously as some years ago, because it's just some pages covered with a script, and I mean, life is also somewhere else. Although sometimes, I mean, I know that like writing is the only thing I have, but sometimes I think like, who cares? It doesn't really matter. So I got a little bit lost in what I was talking about. Yeah.
But when I wrote my first novel, which came out last year, I felt that I spent so much time just thinking, can I write or not? And now somehow I know, okay, I published a book, I know how to do this. Mm-hmm. But the first book is more like, it's kind of, you take a journey and you don't know where you're going to land and if it's going to be something in the end. But when you started writing it, did you picture it would be like this in the end?
You mean whether the book would be like it is?
Would be like this? Did you?
No, it was a pure improvisation. I wrote this book after I came back from Mongolia, where I spent 1 year as a student at the university, and I began to write there actually. Because I got homesick and I felt lonely and the winter was harsh, so I told myself, well, you should get yourself some routine, so why don't you try to write? So I made this resolution to write 3 pages every day, and then after I came back to Prague, I realized that it was all crap and it's not worth it to rewrite it in computer, but this urge to write, this kind of lust, was somehow already there, and so I began from the scratch and ended up with this book. In the beginning I didn't really know what it would be about. The just first sentence somehow came to my head, and I was so full of my experience from Mongolia that the first sentence was from Mongolian setting. So then I somehow continued to tell the story of this narrator I didn't really know very much about, and so her story gradually unfolded, and then I ended it up, and I felt like, well, you wrote a story about this girl, but there is more into there is more in it that was not told yet, so let's try to change the perspective and tell the story from a little bit different point of view of the sister of this character. So then I was in the first person telling the story of the sister, and then again in the end I was like, well, still there are more things that were not told, so I continued with other female from the family telling her story from her perspective. And then after I finished these 3 characters, I thought like, well, that could be an interesting method how to do a book, a novel, so let's continue with 2 more voices and then it will be finished. So I added another 2 voices and the book was finished. So in the end I really didn't have any idea how it would end up, but it's in most cases when I write I don't have clear idea in the beginning. I just have this urge and the feeling there is something inside I want to say, and I have this like visual picture of some kind of, let's say, landscape of the book, and it has like colors and a certain perspective. It's a rather abstract picture, but it kind of includes all what I want to put into the book in the emotional level. So what I wanted to say, no, I didn't have a clear idea before the book was finished.
There's, as you said, there's a lot of voices in this book, and I think it brings a bigger picture, but it's also striking how many of the feelings and the experiences that these women in the book actually share. They live, some live in the city, some live in the country, but they seem to share a lot of feelings and have them in common. And because of how many books that is written in a male perspective with and is about men, it's also striking. There's only female voices in the novel. Was this something that you thought about during the writing?
Not really. I think I felt more confident with the female voices because I thought I knew them better. So I was a little bit, I think, that time dare to speak in a voice of a man. Though men are, I think, strongly present there, and they are important for these women. They just don't have their own voice, but there was no like feminist attitude behind it. I think I just was not confident enough to write in a man's voice.
One experience that I thought a lot about during the reading, that they all share, is some kind of feeling of shame. I felt like this feeling of shame is incorporated into their female bodies and the female sexuality. Many of them get raped, they have unwanted children, and they have to make money through prostitution, and also they all have a feeling that this is something natural, it's something that is part of being a woman, having a female body, having a female sexuality.
I think, as you put it, it sounds more dramatic than it really is. I think that in Mongolia, simply life is harsher than in Europe, in various senses, and also in a bodily sense, and in a sense of what does it mean to be a female. It's tough. It's tough in our perspective, but this example just came to my mind. It's like, I wouldn't say tradition, but it's quite normal in the countryside that first sexual intercourse of a girl or young woman happens, somewhere in the steppe, while the girl is, watching the sheep, and it's basically kind of a rape by a member of a wider family, some kind of like uncle, or not really uncle, but somebody from the wider circle. And that's how it is very often. And it's not being considered a rape, but actually it's kind of a rape. And so I think for the reader, the stuff women go through in the book might seem often like harsh and rude, but that's not the way how they take it. Yeah.
No, but because I thought about that you can, I read it and thought about my own position, my own body, and how I'm living in another culture, and it's I have a free life and independency, but I as well I have to be afraid of getting raped and beaten and those kind of things. So I read it very much like that. But you could also read it and just say, "Oh, these poor girls who has to live in Mongolia, and they're so oppressed, and what a hard life they live." And I'm so glad that I live in this illuminated modern world.
You are afraid of getting raped and beaten?
Yeah,
Are
sometimes when
Wow.
I go home at night.
Yeah.
You're not?
No, it didn't really ever come to my mind. Maybe I should be afraid.
I don't want to start any fear.
Yeah, so what was your question?
No, have you had any reactions like, "Oh, I'm so glad I don't live in Mongolia," or stuff like that?
Yeah. That was probably my own reaction after the year that I spent in Mongolia, that I wouldn't probably wanted to spend the rest of my life there. Though thanks to the fact that the way Mongolians and Mongolian women accept their life and don't really problematize it with, you know, all these things we think about, like male oppression, patriarchic structures and stuff like that. I mean, that's not really the way how they think about their life. So I don't want to say they are happy. Often they are not, but they don't complicate it as much as we do, and to keep life less complicated often means to gain more happiness out of it.
Yeah. When we talked a little bit last week over email, you also said that this novel is a kind of meditation over just female happiness. If it's all about revolting or sticking to the rules proved by generation. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there is this main character who leaves the village, the traditional life, and goes to the city looking for other life, modern life, emancipation, however you name it. And she ends up quite sadly back in the village after a prostitution experience, and she is lonesome, has a child without a partner, and but at the same time her sister, she sticked to the traditional family life and stays in the countryside and has a couple of kids and a good husband, but also her life is not, you wouldn't name it like completely happy, or it isn't any model to be followed. So somehow somehow I just felt there is no rule one should follow that brings happiness, and it's just all struggle and pain in the end, whatever path you choose. It's quite a sad book in this sense of like a general idea that is behind it. I mean, you don't really see much perspective, but that's how I thought the world was 10 years ago, and actually not very much has changed since that.
No, it's very. I felt that too when I was reading, and Saya and also Nara, her sister, they moved to the city, and I felt that okay, now it's gonna happen. They're gonna be free, and it's really strong when they don't get free. The structures follows them, and they're really kind of unhappy in the city as well.
Yeah, but I wouldn't really name it structure. I think you tend to you tend to see oppressive structures behind these life stories. I think that just life is difficult and often unhappy, also without any reason, and I wouldn't really my terrible English, I wouldn't really find some structures guilty of it. I mean, sometimes it might be a matter of structures, but that's also the way how we tend to think about the world. We like to put our lives into these like neat shelves of like, you know, some kind of structures, and I think pure accident plays a big role, and most of what is important is simply unexplicable, and we just yearn to explain it, but maybe we just cannot.
But you talk about the freedom and that they don't get free in the city. Are we talking too much about freedom today? Are we struggling too much to get free?
I think we do, because I think what is important more is probably some kind of happiness, and happiness often somehow overlaps with freedom, but not always. And then one might choose rather happiness over freedom than freedom over happiness, because freedom might mean also just loneliness and isolation, and then what's the meaning of it?
In the novel, it's the big city that they go to find this freedom, and we have an idea that it's in the cities you're going to find the freedom and emancipation. And how do you think about that?
I don't know. Well, probably emancipation we associate with like Western society that is rather urban than country-like, village-like. So that's the connection between emancipation and the city. I mean, we in the Europe mostly live in the cities, but city as such, I don't know whether it has itself any power to emancipate. Maybe in a way that in the city people usually don't know their neighbors, so they can rather do whatever, and there aren't these like mechanisms of control of, like, you know, neighbors that know each other, so you can't really behave as you want because you are being watched. So there aren't these mechanisms of control, and that might be emancipating somehow, but also alienating. And I think I wouldn't say I'm traditional. I do label myself being a feminist, though it's quite unpopular in my country. But something a little bit pulls me also back, because feminism does not always bring happiness to women, and that's important to bear in mind.
Both Saya and Nara also have another dimension of shame. They have different fathers, one through a secret love affair and one through a rape, but they are both raised by the father of their sisters. And they look different, and it's obvious that they are not entirely Mongolian. it kind of struck me that it's often those small things in the novel that affects the way that the people gets to become a part of a communion, be a part of a group or not. And it's also something universal, which become very clear in the text, which group we get to be a part of and relate to.
Yeah, in Mongolia, this ethnical moment is quite important and plays its role. Mongolia is a country that basically borders just with Russia and then with China, and the country itself in its history always had to waggle in between these two powers, and always Russians, I mean, when you have just this like when you can choose in between two, I mean, you have to choose with whom you would stick to, and Russians were always those to whom Mongolians wanted to stick to, because China has been always more scary for them, and even more now. But that's not the point. The point is that Mongolians are quite ethnophobic, I would say. Probably it's natural in a way that they are small nations, so they kind of hysterically want to keep clean and mixed people of like mixed marriages are not really considered to be equal, especially when they are half Chinese. So that's also a topic in this book, how it is to be a bastard in Mongolia, and what does it mean. Yeah.
But what does it mean for? I know you write a little bit about it, but it seems like these girls, at the same time, they have strong traditions, but in the same time, they feel that they miss something. They don't really have roots because they don't know where to belong, really.
Yeah, because the father that raised them was not their biological father. So that's where their kind of alienation came from, and their urge to leave the family and find some other real nest somewhere else, while the younger sister, who is of the father who raised all the kids, kind of feels okay with her life and stays in the village, because in her life everything seems to be okay. So I think the somehow unbalanced or distorted family, of course, is a reason for one to go on a search and feel unsatisfied with his or her life, but sometimes I think it can be also a creative force in a way. When you are not satisfied, it makes you try to do something with your life, and it's basically dissatisfaction is a creative force. I think, had I been from a happy family, would I have ever begun to write? I don't know, probably not. So also it resembles my own family somehow, this story, although it is from Mongolia.
Today, I was thinking about Sarah and Naya, and they are moving and they coming to the city. when I read parts of this, I was at home at my family's house over the Easter holidays, and they live in a small village in the north of Sweden, and I have both my family and all my relatives there, and I moved to this city about 10 years ago, and it's many in our generation do that move. We must come to the city because we want to find other opportunities, and also because there are more job opportunities in the bigger cities. But it also struck me that I don't have really that contact. We don't really have that contact with our parents or with relatives that maybe they had, because we are so many who is moving. And I think that is also a big point in. And I'm thinking about a scene where Saya gets back, and she has a flashlight with her, and she gives it to her mother, and her mother doesn't know how to use it. And that's a really big gap between them.
Yeah, well, I think the difference between countryside and the city in Sweden is nothing in comparison with the difference in Mongolia, where it is completely two different worlds. Ulaanbaatar, which is named the city. If you refer to the city, it's always Ulaanbaatar, because it's the only actually big city in Mongolia. And the countryside, where people live the same way of life as they been living decades ago, and the city changes very, very quickly. The countryside also changes, but in much not as fast. So and it is a big issue in a way that people go from the countryside to the city to somehow allured by whatever city as a symbol means.
Yeah.
But in fact, they often end up on the outskirts, in the yurts, in the gers, in these like tents. The suburb of Ulaanbaatar is all made up of these tents. So half of the people live in prefab blocks of apartment houses, and half of the people live in these like tents in quite horrible conditions. So it kind of rise your status when you move from the countryside to the city. But actually, people living in the city live much poorer life than in the countryside, because in the countryside, basically, nobody gets really poor in a sense of being hungry, because everybody has animals, and once you have animals, you are not hungry. So people in the city often become or are dependent on their relatives from the countryside, who send them, meat and stuff, and they visit often their countryside relatives to gather all the products and go back to the city, where they live in the city but poor. So it's quite a interesting phenomenon.
How come they stay when they?
Well, sometimes I just don't know myself. I asked many times this question, like how can they live and what they actually live on. But there is this gray economy in Mongolia. I don't really understand very much, but it's in many poor countries that average wage is like, I don't know, $50 per month. It was in Mongolia 10 years ago. But then you see many people having very good cars and being clothed in nice dresses, and you don't know where the money come from, and they don't really tell you because you are a foreigner and you wouldn't understand anyway. So although I wrote this book that takes place in Mongolia and I study the field and I kind of understand the culture, still there are many phenomena that just spin my head around and I don't have a clue.
I'm going to open up and hear if the audience have any questions for Petra.
Well, Station Taiga I wrote some years after this book, and it takes place in Siberia, and it's a story of a man who in the 40s decided to go to Siberia to make a documentary movie there, and he went there and he got lost and never came back. And you don't know what happened to him, and his story unfolds in the book slowly, and in the end you discover what happened to that guy. And yes, it was, I wouldn't dare to write a book that takes place in Siberia without really knowing the place somehow. So I went a couple of times to Siberia, and also I wrote the book there, traveling from one little town to the other with my laptop and writing it. I think there is just some kind of fascination that pulls me towards the east, towards Far East, and that's it. I don't know whether I answered your question. Was it about my experience? Well, my first big experience actually with... In Denmark. Yeah, I've been to Denmark. The guy who decided to go to Siberia to make a movie actually was Danish. Yeah, that's what you refer to. It's kind of it's based on my friend. He is a Danish anthropologist, and he spent also a lot of time in Siberia with hunting tribes on the Far East, and so he was the one that I was inspired by when I was creating this character. Yeah, it was funny when I had a reading in Denmark from this book. There was a question from the audience, like, why did you choose to make your character Danish? You are Czech. And I told them the same I told you. There was this anthropologist, blah, blah. And then one guy raised his hand and he was like, you know, wasn't it this guy? And he said the name, and I was like, oh my God, yeah, you are right. How could you know? And this friend of mine, that time he received some big, how you name it, a Queen Prize, or it's like a big prize for his anthropology work. So at that time he became suddenly quite famous in Denmark. So that was a nice coincidence. Mm-hmm. Yeah. My husband wraps it quite aptly. saying I always write 3G fiction. And 3G fiction is that there are always in my books important motives of gender, generation, clash, and geography. That you always part of it is in some distant country. So these 3Gs are basically present in most of my books, and it's something that I keep on working with until now. And you can see it clearly already in my first book. Now I am kind of finishing a novel that is a story of a Ukrainian woman who comes to Prague with her husband to make money to be able to build a house in their village in Ukraine. And she works in Prague as a cleaning lady, and he works as a worker at the building site. And I think it was inspired by our cleaning lady we have at home, and somehow I know a little bit of this like immigrant community in Prague, and I felt that Czechs usually still until nowadays, though we became relatively rich after in last 20 years after the fall of communism, we still consider ourselves being like Easterners and like, poor brothers of Western Europe, which is not really so much true anymore. I mean, it is true in some ways, but already we are the rich West for this other East, more eastwards. So I think rarely anybody reflects on it, and I just wanted to somehow show my country as this like rich destination for other Easterners, and reflect on Czech reality nowadays a little bit through their eyes. So the novel is basically the story of this lady and her family, and a little bit different perspective on what's going on in my country.
No more questions. I'm gonna ask you about there are some Mongolian words in this book that is untranslated and without any explanation, and somehow you get to you understand it anyway. What made you keep the Mongolian words in the book?
Well, is there a vocabulary in the end of the book? There isn't, probably. In some of the translations there is a vocabulary, in some of them it isn't. I'm glad, because vocabulary makes it like somehow like a book of ethnography or something, which is not. But in some translations they just insisted on having vocabulary there. There were originally even more Mongolian words in the text, but then Czech editor in the publishing house made me to erase some of them and replace them by Czech synonyms, because she thought it was just too much. But I think, first of all, it just came naturally to my head to use in some situations just Mongolian words, because after 1 year in Mongolia speaking just Mongolian, they somehow popped up, by themselves in my head. And also I think it does not really matter when you don't understand exactly the meaning of the word. I mean, you still are able to, you know, understand what's going on in general, and this feeling of not understanding, I think adds somehow to what's going on in the novel, because there are moments difficult to explain and difficult to understand even for the characters. So at moments you share the same feeling with the language.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, you get very close to the people in the novel also because there are words that you don't understand, it's their language. You said that some of the translation had a the word, yeah. But did you insist that they shouldn't be there? How much could you? How much how much influence did you have on the result?
No, not much really. I mean, that's the matter of the publishing house to decide. When they asked me, I was always against it, but they are the ones who decide. So I didn't have much influence on it. I also didn't have much influence on the title that is pitifully different in all the languages. I mean, not in all of them, but there are a couple of titles this book has in other languages. So that's also something I'm not really very happy with, but the title itself in Czech is kind of weird grammatically, so it's difficult to translate it and to you know keep what it has in Czech. I think now I probably wouldn't ever you know come up with such a awkward title, already thinking a little bit about like the possibility of being translated, but those days it really didn't come to my mind, so the title is awkward, and as a result it has a different title in all the languages. This is the title it has in English actually. Okay. Yeah.
Any more questions?
No, I'm not a new phenomenon. I mean, each writer wants to think of herself as a new and original phenomenon and like not a part of any like group and generation. But of course, I'm just part of the Czech literary scene, and it's difficult to judge it from my perspective because I'm just like inside, but I think that, you know, being here a literary critic, he would like, you know, just post me next to this one and in between those ones because of this and that, and I'm just this like small stone in the mosaic of Czech literature, influenced by all the others and growing up on my ancestors. It's quite interesting, this book actually. There were critics that thought when the book was published that the real author of the book was Joachim Topol, a Czech writer. There were also a couple of his books translated into Swedish. So that's the author my writings are being compared with, or at least were compared with. So I would definitely mention him, and also probably Bohumil Hrabal I would mention. It's kind of colloquial language. That's also something that is dear to my heart, and yeah, and I really adore Franz Kafka, but his writing is completely different from mine. In Czech, it's well, I just can't translate it. It's something like in the memory of my grandmother, but not really.
I think that's a good finish. Thank you for coming, Petra.
Thank you for coming.